The Holy Gospel for the day is taken from the 7th chapter of the Gospel according to St. Mark. You can go too. I forgot to tell Creighton, bless his heart, so we'll let them. From there, Jesus set out and went away to the region of Tyre. He entered a house and did not want anyone to know he was there. Yet he could not escape notice. But a woman whose little daughter had an unclean spirit immediately heard about him, and she came and bowed down at his feet. Now the woman was a Gentile, of Syrophoenician origin. She begged him to cast the demon out of her daughter. He said to her, "Let the children be fed first, for it is not fair to take the children's food and throw it to the dogs." But she answered him, "Sir, even the dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs." Then he said to her, "For saying that you may go, the demon has left your daughter." So she went home, found the child lying on the bed, and the demon gone. Then he returned from the region of Tyre, and went by way of Sidon towards the Sea of Galilee in the region of the Decapolis. They brought to him a deaf man who had an impediment in his speech, and they begged him to lay his hand on him. He took him aside in private, away from the crowd, and put his fingers into his ears, and he spat and touched his tongue. Then, looking up to heaven, he sighed and said to him, "Ephphatha," that is, "be opened." And immediately his ears were opened, his tongue was released, and he spoke plainly. Then Jesus ordered them to tell no one, but the more he ordered them, the more zealously they proclaimed it. They were astounded beyond measure, saying, "He has done everything well. He even makes the deaf to hear and the mute to speak." The word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Please be seated. Let us pray. Holy One, send your Spirit for this word. Anoint the word that it would be your words to us today, and open our hearts that we might hear what you would have us know. Amen. In the old comic strip Peanuts, it's Thanksgiving Day, and Snoopy is depressed because Snoopy is outside with his bowl full of dog food, and everyone else is inside having turkey, and he is lamenting that everyone's having turkey. He trots off to his doghouse, climbs up on top of the doghouse, lays there for a moment contemplating, and then he says, "Well, things could be worse. I could have been born a turkey." The Syrophoenician woman in the gospel reading for today is a suspect from the very beginning. In first century Jewish thought, she was born a turkey, or at least a dog. And that's because of who she is and her very nature. For one thing, she is a Gentile living in the city of Tyre. Tyre was one of the major cities of Phoenicia in the province of Syria, and it was a highly Gentile area. So she's a Gentile woman, and under Jewish law, that makes her racially inferior. Then, in addition to that, she's a woman. And no self-respecting man would speak to a woman in this kind of a setting. They really didn't speak to lone women. They would never be alone with a woman, most especially a good man, a man who was a holy man. That just would not have been done. So from the very beginning, the tone is set. She really has no right to come and speak to Jesus at all. And yet she takes it upon herself to have the courage to come and speak to Jesus and to plead for the healing of her little daughter. Whatever else you might think is wrong with this woman, if you're a first century Jewish person, and whatever else we might conjure up to be wrong with her, she is at the very least a good and loving parent, because she takes her courage into her hands, and she takes what faith she has, and she comes to Jesus to plead for her little daughter. It can't have been easy. I mean, can you imagine how difficult that must have been for her? But she does it because her love for her daughter is so large. And I think that's what's shocking about Jesus' response to her, because Jesus denies her, at least in the beginning. He says, "It is not fair to give the food that belongs to the children to a dog." And actually, that's worse than it sounds, because that word for dog there is a word that means unclean. It almost, you have to think of this and wonder, is this Jesus? Is this our Jesus, the Jesus that we know, who's so embracing of the brokenness of humanity? Has he somehow succumbed to ideas of Jewish purity as others in his culture had done? But the woman is tenacious. She just kind of stands her ground, and she says to him, "Yes, but even the dogs receive the crumbs." Now, when she says that, she's bringing to mind the whole Jewish tradition of whoever is in the vicinity gets fed. You may know that in the early days, when the Jews were nomads, they would go out when it was mealtime and stand on the nearest sand dune and call out, "Anyone who is in the vicinity, come and eat with us." And they would feed enemy and friend alike. That was just their hospitality. She's actually reminding him of that. You know, even if there's not enough food for the main meal, we still get the crumbs, we who are not otherwise a part of the family. And Jesus responds to that and says to her, "Your daughter has been healed." Her tenacious faith has brought healing for her daughter. A good ending, right? Except there's some things about it that are kind of troubling, aren't there? I mean, doesn't Jesus' denial of her in the beginning kind of make you wonder and make you a little bit worried? I think it does for me. Over the years, I've heard lots of explanations of why Jesus would do that. One that's kind of popular is to say that he is being sarcastic. He is making a sarcastic appraisal of the Jewish purity laws. And Jesus sometimes does use sarcasm. He does it principally when he is trying to help someone see that they're misusing power. So if he'd have been saying this to a Pharisee, it might have made that point. But it's not very often done with anyone else. And besides, you know, if you're making a sarcastic point, there's usually some hurt in it, isn't there? I mean, if you have something about which you feel inferior in yourself, or you're self-conscious about it, and someone makes a sarcastic comment about that or jokes about it, even if it's meant to be funny or to make a point, it still hurts. And so if Jesus is using a sarcastic appraisal of the purity laws of Israel, it may well make the point he's making, but it still has a kind of hurt for the woman. Second idea is that Jesus is testing her to see how deep her faith is. Jesus does do that sometimes, not very often. It's as likely for Jesus to heal somebody without them even asking as it is for him to test her. But we all know that sometimes we get tested. I bet there's no one in this crowd who hasn't had some kind of testing of their faith that has happened. And the thing about Jesus is Jesus always seems to know what we need in this regard. Sometimes we just need comfort, and sometimes we do need to be tested a little bit, and it makes it difficult for us to see how that can be helpful. But one of the things you might recognize, that if Jesus is using this to test the woman, then it might remind us that sometimes the hurtful things in our lives are actually things that help our faith to grow. Even so, if this is a testing, it still has a hurtful edge for the woman. Don't you know, every time you've been tested, I saw some people nodding that they've been tested, that there's hurt in that. It's not comfortable. It's not comforting. It's often painful. A third option, which is the more accepted of the options among biblical commentators, is that this has nothing to do with the woman's status. It has everything to do with the mission of Jesus. In this understanding, Jesus doesn't reject her because of her status or because she's a Gentile. After all, in a few minutes, he does give her what she wants. And after his resurrection, the Gentile mission starts in its fullness. And not only that, historically, all throughout his ministry, Jesus treats those who are considered to be unclean with kindness and mercy, and he himself is willing to be unclean by touching a dead body or touching a woman who's bleeding or eating with sinners. And so you can't explain it by that. So what else is going on? Well, what else is going on is that the timing is not right. How many times in your lives have you found that to be the case in your faith journey? The timing is not right because Jesus has been very clear all throughout his ministry that his principal ministry is to the mission for the Jews, and it won't start among the Gentiles until after his resurrection. It's not that he rejects the woman, it's that the timing is not right. And we begin to wonder, what is Jesus doing with this different kind of timing? We don't have the answer to that. We just know that in God's time, there is a time for all healings. And so we watch for that and we listen for that. And Jesus proceeds to do that healing for her in that instance. And so now, you look at this and you have three pretty good ideas of what might have been going on, and there's probably truth in all three of them. It's just that there's an edge of hurt in all three of them, because even the last one, haven't you noticed when you're waiting on God's timing that sometimes it's painful, that you don't always feel so very comforted in that time waiting space of God? So all of them have this edge of hurt. I have to tell you, that bothered me. That nagged at me. I stewed over that. I brewed over that. I prayed over that. I even remembered my homiletics professor telling me one time, the gospel comforts the afflicted and afflicts the comfortable. But I couldn't get any peace from that either, because this seems the opposite. It seems almost to afflict the already afflicted. And then something dawned on me. And that is what Jesus is actually doing here. What the long-term effect of this event really is. And that is that Jesus is going to the cross. And there on the cross, in this single-minded desire to get to the cross, will come the ultimate healing of all humanity. And it struck me that when Jesus is on the cross, he experiences all of those kinds of things that we have talked about. I mean, surely the cross was a humiliating and terrible experience. On the cross, Jesus is treated with savagery, but he is also treated with lies and false testimony and sarcastic words. Don't you remember? They said, "Haven't you heard his blasphemy about the one who is God? How can God blaspheme God?" And they said, let's let Barabbas go and send this guy, this rabbi, to be crucified. In that, they're saying, what you are, Jesus, is worse than a murderer, someone who just walks up to people and takes their life. And they said, "This hail, the King of the Jews." But they didn't say it with worship the way that we say it. They said it with mockery. And they said, "If you are who you say you are, come down from the cross." Words that were said to a person who never should have been there in the first place. And so we see that comes to Jesus sarcasm and sardonic words and mockery and hatred. And you can know with certainty that the nails and the lashes hurt, but so also did those words. Jesus faced and endured that because of the ultimate goal to bring healing to a broken humanity. And we should be comforted in that. When we experience those times in our lives, we have a God who's been there and knows what that feels like. And we can know that we are understood and loved, and someone went to the mat for us to heal us. And Jesus on the cross was tested. My God, why have you forsaken me?" What could be more of a test than to be alone and God forsaken? That's what Jesus endured. He faced all of that because the ultimate goal was to bring healing and salvation to a broken humanity. And surely in Jesus' death and resurrection, the mission of Jesus now spreads to everyone, broadly, to Jews and Gentiles alike, to people who had for generations been sworn enemies with one another. That moves out into the rest of the world, and Jesus endures the cross in order that healing and salvation might come to a broken humanity. And I think it tells us this. I think it means that if you are undergoing some kind of hurt or humiliation, or if you are undergoing some kind of testing, whatever those things are that are going on in your life, even if you think you are failing, if you suspect you have failed, if you worry you will fail in the future, Jesus never fails. Jesus doesn't fail. He goes to the cross, and in what looks like the worst failure in human history, real success comes, because in his death and resurrection is the healing of all of us, given as a gift. In January of 1994, when I was still serving my internship and a part-time interim in Central Ohio, a young man came to my office one day, said he wanted to talk. He said that he'd like to be confirmed, but since he was almost 18 and going to graduate from high school in a few months, would I be able to figure out some way for him to get through confirmation in time to be confirmed before he went to college? I said, "Are you willing to do the work, and will you meet with me? And if so, then we can do that." And he said yes, he would do that. The first meeting went pretty well. I'd seen him some, but I didn't really know anything of his story. The first meeting went just almost as I had expected it. He was very, very well prepared. He'd learned all the material and additional things. He had great questions to ask. It was in the second meeting that things went differently. I don't remember anymore why, but somehow he got to talking about his childhood. He said that he had been baptized as a Roman Catholic, that his parents had divorced when he was 4 years old, and he had lived with his mother. He said that all that time after that, she did everything she could to keep him away from his father, which bothered him, but what bothered him all the more was the steady stream of live-in boyfriends that her mother had. He detested them, all of them, he said, but especially Ralph. And then all of a sudden, this young man's face just contorted, his body shook with sobs, and he began to tell me about 4 terrifying years of physical and sexual abuse on the part of this man, Ralph, who had lived with his mother from the time he was 6 until he was 10. Well, needless to say, we had many conversations after that, and he had counseling which lasted into his adult years. But eventually he did get confirmed just before I left, and he graduated from high school. On the morning of his confirmation, I arranged it so that the confirmation would be at the very beginning of the service, and then he came right up and served as the assisting minister, as a sign to him that God's healing was at work in his life. He went on to college and graduated and got a job, and it lasted a couple years, and then he let me know that he had gone back to school, to seminary. And about 10 years or so ago, I was privileged to be a part of his ordination into Word and Sacrament ministry, because when God heals us, we are healed indeed. The testing and humiliation and brokenness of his life was overcome by the healing of Christ on the cross, because Jesus never fails. And whatever it was that he thought was failure in his life was overcome by Christ's victory on the cross, because Jesus never fails. And whatever is in any one of our lives will be overcome by Christ's victory on the cross for healing and hope and purpose and comfort, because Jesus never fails.